והכל חיילי צבא הגנה לישראל, תן בהם כוח, זריזות ושמחה, לקיים מצוות עזרת ישראל מיד צר, ותן בהם אומץ, תבונה וגבורה. שמור אותם מכל צרה וצוקה, פגע ומכשול והחזירם לביתם ומשפחתם שלמים בגופם. מקוים בהם מקרא שכתוב, האל המעזרני חי, וייתן תמים דרכי, ייתן בהם כוח.
What a pretty song. What a pretty song from Kippah Live. It's an a cappella group from Israel. Basically a prayer and a song for the safety of Israel and for the peace of Israel and for the safety of those who keep the peace in Israel. And we should only hear good news about the peace of Israel and the whole world. And we say Amen. How's everybody doing? Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us as we do a double daf, a double page. We didn't have class yesterday on Father's Day, so we'll be doing 2 pages today. Who is with us as we get it going on a Monday night? Paula in Chicago, Sharon in New Jersey, Allison in North Carolina, Gail in Virginia, Paula in the hot Northwest, PK in Colorado, John in Sedona. There's fires in northern Arizona. Pray for the firefighters and rain. Amen. May we get rain to put out the fire, and may the firefighters there and everywhere be safe. Melissa in Great Neck, Renee in Indiana, Jennifer in Florida, Tom in PA. James in Indianapolis, Guy is with us, Lucy in Minnesota, and Belle in Illinois. Keeps jumping on me. Everyone is saying amen to the prayer. Terry is with us from Buffalo. Over there on the YouTube side, Marjorie in Georgia, and Gigi saying shalom from British Columbia. Welcome, everybody. Let's jump right into it. It's a double daf, and there's a lot to cover, and there's some really beautiful teachings in these 2 pages. This is daf Ayin and Ayin Aleph, pages 70 and 71. Here in Tractate Yoma, this is the 6th volume of the Talmud, the laws of Yom Kippur, as it was observed when the tabernacle or the temple was standing. We are in chapter 7. With God's help, we'll be completing our discussion of the first Mishna of chapter 7 and beginning and completing the discussion of the second Mishnah and starting the third Mishnah. So lots to do. Okay, on the top of the A side of page 70, or near the top, it was taught in the Mishnah, in the first Mishnah of chapter 7, that the priest, in addition to doing all of the avoda, all of the, the very physical services that he does on Yom Kippur, lighting the incense, bringing the coal pan and the incense into the Holy of Holies, slaughtering animals, receiving their lifeblood, sprinkling that blood as an atonement on the curtain and inside the Holy of Holies as well, making the lottery to select between the goat that's offered as a sin offering in the temple and the one that's sent to Azazel. There's other offerings that we're going to be discussing today, but in addition to all those things and changing his clothes repeatedly in order to accomplish those things, there also is a public Torah reading when the temple was standing. So similar to how we have public Torah reading on Shabbat in our synagogues, and as well on Monday and Thursday mornings. So there was a public reading of the Torah, what passages from the Torah, the ones having to do with the observance of Yom Kippur. So it was stated in the Mishnah that the Torah portion, beginning with the verse and on the 10th, meaning on the 10th of the first month, on the 10th of Tishrei, which is when Yom Kippur happens. So at Numbers 29:7, so that's where it's detailed what the high priest does on Yom Kippur. So there was first two other sections that he read, but then with regard to this other section from the book of Numbers, so he reads from the Torah the passages from the book of Leviticus, but this passage from the book of Numbers he reads by heart. The Mishnah says he reads it by heart. And the Gemara asks, why does he read it by heart? Let him furl the scroll to that portion and read it from the text, right? So he's reading there's three passages that he's reading. Two, he's going to read directly from the Torah, like the Torah is open before him and he reads from it. But this third passage, the first two are from the book of Leviticus, the third book in the Torah. This third passage that he reads is from the fourth book of the Torah, the book of Numbers. So why doesn't he read that directly from the Torah scroll? Why does he have to memorize it? The Gemara suggests, let him furl the scroll, meaning roll it, right? Because it's a Torah's double-rolled scroll, right? It's got two, what are they called? The two poles that the Torah is rolled on. And so when we read, we unroll one and roll up the other. So it's always about the same amount of the Torah is exposed. So why doesn't he just roll to the next section, to that part that he wants to read? Why is he doing it by heart? And Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua, said, that Rav Sheshes said, it is because one may not furl a Torah scroll in public out of respect for the community. It is inappropriate to make the community wait until they have reached the next section. Now, if you're a regular synagogue goer, you may well remember a time when the Torah was rolled, right? Very often, like when we have the Rosh Chodesh section, because we have a passage on a new month, right? If Rosh Chodesh falls on Shabbos, so we have to read from different sections of the Torah on that day. When Rosh Chodesh, which falls in the middle of Hanukkah, sometime during Hanukkah, there's always the new month of Teves, or of Kislev, right? So we enter a new month during Hanukkah, and sometimes that happens on Shabbos. And then we have 3 Torah scrolls that we bring out if the synagogue has 3 Torah scrolls. There are 3 passages that need to be read from different portions of the Torah. When that happens, when the new month, Rosh Chodesh, within Hanukkah, also falls on Shabbos. So there's 3 different sections that need to be read. And if a synagogue is so blessed as to own 3 Torah scrolls, they bring out 3 Torah scrolls. They've each been pre-rolled to the section that needs to be rolled that day. But not every synagogue has 3 Torah scrolls. In fact, our humble minyan here in our neighborhood, it's a backyard minyan. It's been meeting in a backyard since COVID. And we only have 1 Torah scroll. So it often happens, like when there's Rosh Chodesh on Shabbos, which, it happens somewhat regularly, that we have to roll the Torah from one section to the other in order to do the 2 readings that are prescribed for that day. Now, we just read in the Gemara that we should not do that, right? That you should not roll a Torah scroll in front of the congregation simply because it makes them wait, and it's considered like a dishonor of the congregation. However, what is the law? A Torah scroll is not rolled before a waiting congregation out of respect for the assembly, in accordance with the Gemara here. But if there is only 1 Torah scroll from which 2 different passages must be read, it is rolled despite the delay caused to the congregation. In that situation, the people understand and they forgive the slight to their honor. So it's better for a synagogue or a congregation to own or to have access to multiple Torah scrolls, but it doesn't always happen. And when it doesn't happen, okay, so then everybody waits while you roll from one section to the next. Now, but what about on Yom Kippur as it was practiced when the temple was standing? Now here, it says that the high priest reads from one section of the Torah scroll, and then he does the other part by memory. Okay, well, certainly the temple had access to a second Torah scroll. Why don't they bring a second scroll to the high priest during Yom Kippur when the temple is standing? Why not let another Torah scroll be brought that has previously been rolled to that portion and read from it? And Rav Huna bar Yehuda said, people might mistakenly think the second scroll was brought due to a flaw that was found in the first one. And Resh Lakish gave a different reason. He said a second scroll should not be brought due to the fact that doing so will cause an unnecessary blessing to be recited before reading from a new scroll, that the high priest would have to repeat the blessings required upon reading from the Torah. Therefore, it is preferable that he read by heart. At any rate, that's the way that it was done when the temple was standing. We skip down a little bit on the page. It was taught in the Mishnah, one who sees the high priest reading the Torah does not see the bull and goat that are burned, and vice versa. We've already discussed that the simultaneous with the high priest reading the Torah publicly in the temple on Yom Kippur, when the temple was standing, there was another service being performed outside of Jerusalem, most likely on the Mount of Olives, or maybe it's even further than that. I guess it must have even been further than that, since outside of Jerusalem. And that was the burning of the carcasses of the bull and the goat that are brought as sin offerings on Yom Kippur. Their sacrificial parts were already offered on the, or stand to be offered on the altar. Their lifeblood that was received in a vessel was sprinkled in the Holy of Holies and in the sanctuary. And so the carcasses now can't be used for any other purpose. They must be destroyed in a prescribed and holy manner. And that's that burning, that special fire. So that's part of the service of Yom Kippur. It's a very holy thing. And people might like to see both the public reading of the Torah by the high priest and the burning of the bull and the goat. But since they happen at the same time and pretty far apart, you can't go to both. Now, this is not because it is not permitted to see both, but because there is a distance between them and they are performed simultaneously. On this, the Gemara comments, it is obvious that this is not due to a prohibition. What possible reason could there be to prohibit this, seeing both? If you could somehow, if you went back in time and you had, a scooter, like a motor scooter, a little motorcycle, and you could get from one to the other place quickly, then you could do it, except you couldn't drive a motor scooter on Yom Kippur, of course. So really, it's impossible to be at both. But the Gemara is commenting, why would you even think that it might be prohibited? Why would you even have that idea in your head? And the Gemara answers, this was taught explicitly that it's only a matter of practicality and there's no prohibition. And that was taught explicitly, lest you say that it would actually be prohibited to do both in accordance with the statement of Reish Lakish. As Reish Lakish says, one does not pass over the opportunity to perform mitzvahs, even if it is in order to perform a different mitzvah. So if you're in one of those locations and you have the opportunity to witness either the priest reading or the carcasses of the bull and goat being burned, so it's happening near you, so that the mitzvah stands before you, so you just do that. You do the mitzvah that's in front of you. You don't pass over a mitzvah. You don't pass over the opportunity to fulfill an obligation, a biblical obligation, even to go perform another mitzvah, right? Even to go fulfill a different obligation. When a mitzvah is in front of you, you do it. That's the same reason why, if you're at a Shabbos dinner, and the custom in that household is that, let's say, the leader of the household recites the Kiddush over the wine on Friday night, and then he gives everyone and so he, the one who recites the Kiddush, has to drink at least a cheekful of wine. And then many people have the custom that he will give a taste of that wine. Everyone else doesn't have to have a cheekful, but most have the custom that everyone else will taste the wine. So then you start passing cups of wine around the table. Now, very often people want to do the polite thing, and when they receive their little glass with a taste of wine in it, they'll pass to the next person and keep passing until everyone has, and then you'll take for yourself. That's actually incorrect. Since they're giving you to taste from the Kiddush wine on Shabbos, so it's a mitzvah. So when the wine comes to you, you drink from that wine, and then the next glass that gets passed, you pass to the next person. They've just received wine, so they taste. And that's the way to properly taste wine at a kiddush. When it's given to you, you drink, and then you pass the next cup that comes along. And it's for just this reason, this teaching of Reish Lakish, that you do not pass over the opportunity to perform a mitzvah. And the Gemara clarifies why this principle might have applied here. And what mitzvah is there in hearing the reading of the high priest? Right? That's not really a mitzvah. You're not commanded to hear the high priest read that Torah portion on Yom Kippur. As we saw, it was optional what clothes he wears. He doesn't have to wear the priestly garments. Therefore, it's not a required, it's not an obligation. That's not part of the prescribed service that the priest would read those Torah portions. So what mitzvah is being performed if you're in the audience hearing the high priest read that? And the answer is, from Proverbs 14:28, the king's glory is in the multitude of people. Right? The glory of the king is in the multitude of the people who ascribe greatness to him, or who witness him, or who serve him. So having a large assembly involved in a mitzvah gives honor to God. Therefore, the Mishnah teaches us that the problem with seeing both events was only a practical one. And that's a good lesson to remember. If there's going to be a public mitzvah, so for example, Chabad rabbis all around the world often do very public menorah lightings, right? Lighting the Hanukkah, lighting the Hanukkah lights in public squares. So if you have an opportunity, if you hear about a menorah lighting at Hanukkah in a public place, go, because your being there ascribes honor to God, right? It's really good to be present when a mitzvah is being performed because it gives more honor to the Holy One. That concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 1. We move on to Mishnah number 2. If the high priest read the Torah in sacred white fine linen garments, and recall we learned that it was optional. He could stay in the fine white linen garments when he reads the Torah, or he could change into private garments. He then sanctifies his hands and feet as he did each time before removing the priestly vestments. He then removed the linen garments, descended to the ritual bath and immersed, and afterwards he ascended and dried himself with a towel. They brought him the golden garments of the high priesthood. Recall that a high priest wears the special garments of the high priest on every day of the year, including Yom Kippur, when he's performing the offices of the high priest for sort of normal daily occurrences, what the high priest does on every day. On Yom Kippur, when he's performing the service that only the high priest does only on Yom Kippur, like entering the Holy of Holies, then he wears special clothes that are only worn on that one day of the year, the very, very fine linen garments. So he changes his clothes several times on Yom Kippur, depending on whether he's doing the service of the high priest in the Holy of Holies or in the sanctuary, the special Yom Kippur services, or if he's doing the daily services that have to be done every day of the year, including Yom Kippur. But when he's doing those, he's dressed as a high priest is normally dressed, which is like the 4 garments of the ordinary priest, plus the 4 additional garments of the high priest, like the golden plate on his forehead, the golden plate in front of him, etc. That's why they're called the golden garments or the golden vestments. And so they brought in the golden garments of high priesthood, and he dressed in them and sanctified his hands and feet, right? So he immerses, then he gets dressed, and then he sanctifies his hands and feet, washes his hands and feet with the special water. And the Mishnah addresses these offerings whose sacrifice has still not been mentioned, right? So up until now, we talked about the bull and the goat that are a sin offering in the temple. We talked about the goat that goes out to Azazel. We talked about the incense offering, but there's other offerings that need to be, and we talked about the daily offerings that were brought in the morning. There's still other offerings that are special to Yom Kippur that we have not yet mentioned. The verses in Leviticus chapter 16 detail the special offerings of the atonement service of Yom Kippur that we have not yet discussed. Of these offerings, the ram of the high priest and the ram of the people have still not been addressed. In addition to this, the additional offerings of Yom Kippur, detailed in the book of Numbers, chapter 29, have also not yet been discussed. And these include 7 one-year-old lambs and a bull to be brought as a burnt offering and a goat to be brought as a sin offering. The bull that we discussed earlier was a sin offering that the high priest pays for out of his own money as a sin offering to atone for himself, his family, and his fellow priests. This other bull is brought as an elevation offering, or also known as a burnt offering, on behalf of the nation. So it's a totally separate offering. Also the 7 lambs, and this other 2 rams, the ram of the priest and the ram of the nation. The Mishnah continues. So he emerged, offered his ram and the ram of the people and the 7 unblemished year-old lambs mandated to be offered that day. This is the statement of Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Akiva says those offerings were not sacrificed at this point. Rather, they were sacrificed with the daily morning offering. And the bull of the Yom Kippur burnt offering and the goat whose services are performed outside the sanctuary, i.e. in the temple courtyard, were sacrificed along with the daily afternoon offering. So what Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva are arguing about is not what offerings are brought. That's clear to everybody. But simply at what time are they brought during the day. Rabbi Eliezer says, and this seems to be the halacha, the law, is that these other offerings that we haven't addressed yet get brought approximately now in the order of the day. Rabbi Akiva says, well, actually, with respect to those 7 lambs, those were already brought during the morning offerings, and it's this bull and the ram that are brought along with the afternoon offering. So after sacrificing these offerings, whenever they're done, once he completes them, he sanctified his hands and feet, and he removed the golden garments. And he descended into the ritual bath and immersed and ascended and dried himself. So I think I misspoke a little bit, right? Because some of these offerings are only brought on Yom Kippur, and he's bringing those offerings while dressed in the golden vestments. So what I meant to say in terms of the fine white linen garments is that he wears those not only for offerings that are particular to Yom Kippur, but also that require that he enter into the Holy of Holies or offerings brought in the sanctuary on Yom Kippur. So there are other offerings that are particular to Yom Kippur, but they're performed in the courtyard, and so when he brings those, it's in the golden vestments rather than in the white linen vestments. So they brought him the white garments again, indicating he's going to be going back inside. Why? They brought him the white garments again, and he dressed in them, and he sanctified his hands and feet, and afterward he entered the Holy of Holies for one more time to take out the incense spoon and the coal pan which he had brought there earlier. Right? When he entered the first time of the day into the Holy of Holies with the coal pan and the incense, he put the incense on the coal pan, the room filled with the beautiful smoke of the incense. Then he left and he returned to do the sprinklings in there. Then he left. And he left the coal pan and the incense spoon in the Holy of Holies. So now, toward the end of the day, he's going to go in there one more time just to recover those utensils, the golden coal pan and the golden incense spoon. Where am I? That he left in there earlier. He again sanctified his hands and feet, and he removed the white garments, and he descended to the ritual bath, and he immersed, and he ascended and dried himself with a towel. They brought him the golden garments once again, and he dressed in them and sanctified his hands and feet and entered the sanctuary to burn the afternoon incense and to remove the ashes from the lamps, which signified the end of the day's service. And he sanctified his hands and feet and removed the golden garments, and he descended to the ritual bath, and he immersed, and he ascended, and he dried himself. He did it. He did everything that he was required to do on Yom Kippur. They then brought him his own clothing, and he dressed, since the service was complete and Yom Kippur was over, and the people escort him to his house in deference to him, right? So this whole crowd that's assembled on the Temple Mount is now going to escort the high priest back to his home. And remember, he left his home a week before Yom Kippur, and he was sequestered in the temple compound for that whole week. So it's only now, for the first time after Yom Kippur is over, after 8 days, that he can return home. Right? And they escort him to his home, and the high priest would make a feast for his loved ones and his friends when he emerged in peace from the sanctuary. Not only is it a feast because they successfully accomplished all the atoning and the service on behalf of the nation, but also because, remember, as we said many times, if the high priest was somehow lacking in personal preparation and purity and holiness and propriety, that he should go into the Holy of Holies, if there was something wrong and he was not properly prepared and in a state fit to enter the Holy of Holies, he would die when he was in the Holy of Holies. So the high priest is, risking his life to serve the nation and enter the Holy of Holies. I don't think a priest ever died in the Holy of Holies in the first temple period, but as we've heard, many died in the second temple period when the spiritual level of the people was so much lower. That is the Mishnah, the second Mishnah of chapter 7. Okay, so now there's going to be a long debate sort of between Eliezer and Akiva, or between the later sages who are espousing the views of Eliezer versus the views of Rabbi Akiva, on the particular order of these additional offerings that are brought during the day of Yom Kippur. Exactly when do they happen? And I'm going to summarize that debate by reading the halacha, the law, as the debate, as they eventually settled on what the outcome of that debate is. So after the high priest reads from the Torah and recites his blessings, he removes his white garments and immerses and dons the golden garments. He sanctifies his hands and feet, and sacrifices the goat for a sin offering, which is the festival's additional offering, and his ram and the people's ram. When we say the additional offering, that's the musaf, right? So just like there are additional offerings for Shabbos on top of the daily offerings, there are also musaf, additional offerings for every festival. And Yom Kippur, though we don't often think of it as a festival because it's a fast day, still it is a festival, and so there's musaf, additional offerings on Yom Kippur. Which is the goat for a sin offering, not the one from the two goats that the lots are drawn on them, but there's an additional goat as a sin offering. That's the festival's additional offering. And he also brings his ram and the people's ram, which is just, it's necessary for Yom Kippur. It's not technically the additional offerings, it's just Yom Kippur offerings. And he burns the sacrificial parts of the bull and the goat, and he sacrifices the daily afternoon offering. He undresses and immerses and dons the white garments and sanctifies himself. He then enters the Holy of Holies and removes the spoon and the coal pan that he left there earlier. He comes out, he immerses and dons the golden garments, sanctifies himself, and he burns the incense of the afternoon like was done in the temple every day of the year. He sanctifies his hands and feet. He takes off the golden garments. He dons his own clothing. Now Yom Kippur is over. He leaves for his home, accompanied by the people who escort him. That is the law. We skip down to the bottom of the B side of page 70. It was taught in the Mishnah. The high priest sanctified his hands and feet and entered the Holy of Holies to take out the incense spoon and the coal pan. And the Gemara cites a related baraisa. The sages taught, the verse states, "And Aaron shall come into the tent of meeting." That's Leviticus 16:23. Which is taken to mean that he enters the Holy of Holies. Why does he come? Well, he comes in order to take out the incense spoon and the coal pan, as the whole portion of the service of the day, detailed in Leviticus, is written in this order, and the service must be performed in that order, except for this verse, which is stated out of order, and it is performed only later. So when the description in the Torah is given of what the high priest has to do on Yom Kippur, basically the high priest would do everything in the order that's detailed in the Torah, except that where it says he should remove the coal pan and the incense from the Holy of Holies, it says it a little bit earlier, and the sages decreed, no, he doesn't do that earlier, he does it later. He does it at this point in the day. And so the question, of course, is going to be why. And the verse detailing his re-entry in Leviticus 16:23 is written before the verse detailing the sacrifice of the rams. But in fact, the re-entry occurs only after the sacrifice of the rams. And the Gemara asks, what is the reason to assume this verse is written out of order? Maybe we should follow the order that's in the Torah. And Rav Chisda said they learned as a tradition that the high priest performs 5 immersions and 10 sanctifications of his hands and feet when he changes clothing on that day. Each time the high priest changes between the white and golden garments, he sanctifies his hands and feet, immerses, dresses in the new set of garments, and then once again sanctifies his hands and feet. And if you say that the verses, including this one, are written in the exact order they're supposed to be done, you find only 3 immersions and 6 sanctifications. Read in order, the verses indicate only 3 changes of garments, which involve 3 immersions and 6 sanctifications. In order to arrive at the requisite number of 5 immersions and 10 sanctifications, one must assume that the high priest's re-entry into the Holy of Holies takes place at a later time, and after he has already changed into the golden garments. And this would require him to change into the white garments and then back into the golden garments, providing the additional 2 immersions and 4 sanctifications. The Gemara will then discuss, well, how do we know that that's the right way it's supposed to be done? The answer is it's a tradition. Where does that tradition go back to? It's one of the oral traditions given to Moses at Mount Sinai. That's the answer. We skip down to near the bottom of the A side of page 71. The Gemara describes the eventual meeting between the high priest and the one who sends the goat to Azazel. So we saw that earlier in the day, the priest, 2 goats were stood before the high priest. He drew out the lots, one to be sacrificed in the temple, the other goat to be sent to the wilderness to Azazel. To take and metaphorically bearing the sins of the people out into the wilderness. Now, the one who was appointed to do that job, to take that goat, and he didn't have to be a priest, but they made it a tradition that it always was a priest. So he took a very long walk during Yom Kippur, minimum of 3 kilometers, maybe as much as 12 kilometers. People accompanied him in relays so that he wasn't alone. They offered him food and water to drink even though he was fasting, because it was more important that he get the goat out to that cliff in the wilderness. He never had to partake of the food and water, but it helped him that it was available if he should need it. And then when he finishes that job, he stays out there. He stays out there on the edge of the wilderness in a booth out of the sun in the shade, and he waits until Yom Kippur is over. And then he returns to Jerusalem, and he tells the people, was the atonement of the nation accepted? Did that string, that red string, half of which was between the horns of the goat that was thrown over the cliff, and the other half of which was on a rock at the top of the cliff, did it turn from red to white? If it did, that would be a miraculous indication that the atonement of the people was accepted in heaven. Late in the Second Temple period, since often that the atonement was not accepted, and it distressed the people during Yom Kippur, the sages decreed that that guy would only come back after Yom Kippur was over, and that's when he brought word of whether the atonement was accepted, whether the red string turned white. So at any rate, he returns to Jerusalem after Yom Kippur is over. So when the one who sends the goat comes on the day following Yom Kippur, and remember, the day following Yom Kippur begins that night, so he can return that night. It's already the next day, since days on the Hebrew calendar begin at nightfall. So he comes on the day after Yom Kippur, and if he finds the high priest in the market. Now, in the market basically means not in a holy place, just somewhere on the streets of Jerusalem. So he says to him, my master, high priest, we performed your mission, i.e., we fulfilled the mitzvah of sending the goat to Azazel. And he refers to the sending as the high priest's mission. that the high priest sent him. It refers to it as the high priest mission as a public display of respect to the high priest. However, if that man, when he returns, only meets the high priest in his own house, right? That night, the high priest is throwing a feast. He survived Yom Kippur. He's so happy. He's having a private party for himself, his friends, his loved ones. But the one who took the goat, the priest who took the goat out to Azazel, is certainly welcome at that party. So if he greets him inside his house, inside the high priest's house, then the one who took the goat out to Azazel says to the high priest, the one who grants life to the living, God, we performed his mission. So in a public place, we ascribe that sending that goat to Azazel was a mission that the high priest sent this ordinary priest on that mission. But if he meets the high priest in private, he says, you and I fulfill the mission that the Holy One gave us. Now, apropos the phrase, the one who grants life to the living, the rabbis said when the sages take leave from one another in Pumbedisa, a city in Babel, in the Babylonian Jewish community, they say as follows, may the one who grants life to the living grant you a long, good, and established life. What a beautiful blessing that is to give to somebody when you're leaving them, right? When you're saying goodbye to somebody, whether you're not going to see them for a long time or you're going to see them later that afternoon. Either way, what a beautiful way to say goodbye. May the one who grants life to the living grant you a long, good, and established life. Further, apropos the phrase, the one who grants life to the living, the Gemara explains a verse using a similar phrase and then additional verses. With regard to the verse from Psalm 116, I shall walk before the Lord in the lands of the living, Rav Yehuda said, this is the place of markets where food and needs can be readily obtained. King David, who wrote the Psalm, and who wandered from place to place during the years that he was running for his life from King Saul who wanted to kill him, prayed to always find ready sustenance. It's funny because I just saw a social media post today where a person said, I am so rich. When I am hot, I can turn on air conditioning. When I need food, I could go to a supermarket up the street and buy thousands of different kinds of food. If I want to get to somewhere far away, there's all kinds of public transportation available in the city where I live. And I might even be so blessed as to own a car that can get me there. There's so much we take for granted. And here King David, who knew, an empty stomach during those years that he was running for his life, even when he was a rich, fabulously wealthy king, he appreciated those simple things. To have a roof over your head, to be able to control the temperature, for goodness sake, but to have food to eat and different kinds of food. What a wealth, what a luxury, what an abundance. And how thankful we should be for that, right? And so it's interesting, so there's times to give respect to your elders, right? So there's a time when the elder stands before you, and the primary duty is to give respect to that elder. But at all times, it's good to thank God for everything in our lives. And when you're in private with the elder, okay, then it's not making a public display of giving respect to the elder. Then you and the elder can just join together, making simple thanks of gratitude to the Holy One. And Rabbi Berekia said, if a person sees that Torah is ceasing from his children, and they are not becoming Torah scholars like himself, what should he do? He should marry the daughter of a Torah scholar. This will ensure that his children from her will be raised with Torah. As it is stated, though its root will grow old in the earth and its trunk will die in the ground, from the scent of water it will blossom and put forth branches like a plant. If the figurative trunk of one's own family is drying up through a lack of Torah, he should plant himself in a place of water, i.e., marry into a family of scholars water being a metaphor for Torah, and this will ensure that his children will blossom into Torah scholars. Now, what we notice there is that for whatever reason, this man who's being referred to here, who loves Torah and studies Torah all the time, and his sons are not into it, and somehow it's just not going to happen. Okay, so he should, and maybe his first wife died, or back then you could have multiple wives, so he should have another wife who is the daughter of a Torah scholar, and she will ensure that her children by him will be Torah scholars. And what do we notice about that? That the level of Torah in the household is not determined by the father, right? The amount of Torah that is learned and cherished in a household is determined by the mother. It's like he's powerless. He can study Torah. He can model Torah scholarship. He can model his love of Torah to his family. But the one who's really going to be dispositive in this, the one who's really going to determine how much Torah is in a family and how much the family loves Torah, is the mom. So while we wish everybody a happy Father's Day belated from yesterday, big kavod, big honor to all the moms out there who are women of faith and who teach the next generation to be thankful to the Holy One, blessed be He. It was taught in the Mishnah, the people escort the high priest to his house, and he would make a feast for his loved ones. And the sages taught in a Baraisa, there was an incident involving one high priest who exited the holy temple, and everyone followed him. And when they saw Shemaiah and Avtalion, and Shemaiah and Avtalion were the pair of sages who were the leaders of their generation, and they were the teachers of Hillel, right? Hillel owed his Torah learning to Shemaiah and Avtalion. And when they saw Shemaiah and Avtalion, the heads of the Sanhedrin, walking along, in deference to them, these people who were escorting the high priest after Yom Kippur back to his house, they sort of peeled away from him and walked after Shemaiah and Avtalion. In other words, they gave more kavod, they gave more honor to the sages of the generation, the leaders of the Sanhedrin in that generation, than they did to the high priest. Now, particularly, this is the late Second Temple period when there were a lot of corrupt priests, priests who sort of got the high priesthood by bribing their way, etc. Now, this is at the end of Yom Kippur. So whoever that high priest was, he entered the Holy of Holies, and he came out, and he's alive. So there's nothing wrong with that high priest. And now he's time to celebrate, and he got a little bit irked that the people were giving more honor to the sages than they were to him on the night following Yom Kippur. Eventually, Shemaiah and Avtalion came to take leave of the high priest before returning to their homes. Envious of the attention that they received, he said to them, with a little bit of bitterness, let the descendants of the Gentile nations come in peace. Now, why was this a sarcastic remark? Because Shemaiah and Avtalion, those great sages who are featured in Pirkei Avos as among the pairs, the great scholars who transmitted the Torah from the previous generation to the next generation, and in the next generation, they educated Hillel and Shammai. So really incredible sages, and so important in the history of Torah among the Jewish people. Both of them, Shemaiah and Avtalion, were converts. They were not born Jews. They converted to Judaism and became such worthy Torah scholars that they became the Torah leaders of the nation. Now, this high priest, who was a little bit irked that the people were giving more honor to the sages than to the high priest, made this sarcastic comment, let the descendants of the Gentile nations come in peace. In other words, reminding them that, you might be the biggest sages of the world, but you're only converts. You weren't born a Jew like me. Now, we've talked about this before. That is absolutely prohibited. On a Torah level, on a biblical level, it is prohibited to in any way denigrate a convert for not being born a Jew. Once a person does a proper conversion and accepts the Torah upon himself through all that conversion requires, a kosher conversion requires, then he's a Jew like anyone else, and it is a sin to somehow say to him, to remind him that he wasn't always a Jew, and particularly to use that as some kind of an attack. So what the high priest said here was prohibited. It was actually sinful. He shouldn't have said that. Shammai and Avtalion, they didn't do anything. The fact that the people who were walking around them just gave more honor to Shammai and Avtalion, it's not something that Shammai and Avtalion caused. They didn't want that to happen. They didn't ask those people to give them more honor than they were giving the high priest. But the high priest took it personally. Now that he insulted them, then they answered him. They said to him, "Let the descendants of the Gentile nations come in peace, those who perform the acts of Aaron, who loved and pursued peace. And let not a descendant of Aaron come in peace, who does not perform the acts of Aaron and who speaks condescendingly to descendants of converts." So as Shammai and Avtalion were reminding this high priest, who is a direct descendant of Aaron, Moses' brother, the first high priest, you have to be a Cohen. They're reminding him that what was Aaron's primary quality that he was known for? I mean, he got the job of high priest and he served beautifully and with distinction. But as a personal trait, what was Aaron like? He was a peacemaker. He was a person who took it personally and made it his mission to help people who were quarreling with each other to find a way to make peace. So the last thing that Aaron would ever do is make fun of somebody and remind them of something that they shouldn't be reminded of, that would be unpleasant for them. So they were saying to him, you may be a descendant of Aaron, but you're not acting like Aaron would. That concludes the discussion of Mishnah number 2, and I'm just about done. We're simply going to read the third Mishnah of chapter 7, and then we'll go to comments and questions. Mishnah number 3. Throughout the year, and it's very short, throughout the year, the high priest serves in 8 garments, and the common priest serves in 4 garments. What are the 4 garments of an ordinary priest? A tunic and trousers, and a mitre and a belt. The mitre is some kind of linen wrap around his head. So they have a tunic, they have trousers, they have the belt, and they have the headpiece. And that's what is required for an ordinary priest. Not mentioned there are shoes, because in fact, priests serving in the temple had to walk barefoot. And if their feet were not in contact with the stones of the floor of the temple, then their service was disqualified, was invalidated. And it can be very cold in Jerusalem in the winter, and that's why they would serve. They would really, put themselves out to do their service. And then when they were off duty, they would rush to the special chamber where there was always a nice fire going in the winter. Those are the 4 garments of an ordinary priest. The high priest adds another 4 garments beyond those worn by the common priest. And what are the 4 that he adds? A breastplate, an ephod, and a robe, and a front plate. And when dressed in these 8 garments, the high priest may be consulted for the decision of the Urim Vetumim. Right? So the Urim Vetumim was an actual, like a hotline to God. And it could be used only when, and he may be consulted for the decision of the Urim Vetumim only on behalf of the king, or on behalf of the president of the court, the head of the Sanhedrin, or on behalf of one whom the community needs. Individual inquiries are not posed to the Urim Vetumim. So the Urim Vetumim was a kind of direct line to God. The high priest, was not a prophet, but in his capacity as high priest, could put certain questions to heaven, and the kinds of questions that would be asked using the Urim Vetumim, which was contained in the breastplate, which also had the 12 stones representing the 12 tribes of Israel. The kinds of question that would be asked is, should we go to war or not? Will God assist us if we go to war? Right? If it's a defensive war, they don't need to ask. They're being attacked. Okay, they need to defend themselves. But if it's a kind of optional war, it seems like it would be good for the nation to go to that war maybe before trouble comes to them, but it's a little unclear, and the king would like to know how God feels about the nation going to war. that's when they would use the Urim V'Tumim. That's what I have today. Let us go to your comments and questions. Just taking a moment. Google signed me out of the document Nina and I used to communicate. Now I'm back in. Okay. Yosef, at this point in time where they are reading the Torah, did they have a complete Tanakh, or was it just the 5 books until later? Are we going to be studying about this later in the Talmud? Was the Tanakh complete? Yes, it definitely was complete. By the time that we're talking about the sages having these discussions, even the Tanaim, the sages of the Mishnah, some of which were experienced the late Second Temple period, even then the Bible was already complete, right? Like, how late did it go? I mean, the book of Esther is really one of the last books to be added, and that detailed what was happening between the first and second temple. There's really not, like, the Hanukkah story, has come down to us, and we read it. There's that book of Maccabees, but that's not part of the Bible. So the Bible had already been canonized. The Hebrew Bible had been canonized by this time. And we have references to Ezekiel, to Job, to Isaiah, to Jeremiah. We often have verses cited. In fact, in today's daf, in the parts that we didn't read, they were saying, well, there's certain laws, actual laws, mitzvahs, that come from not the Torah, but that are detailed elsewhere, like in the book of Ezekiel. And so they asked, well, did they not know what to do until Ezekiel came along and gave the law? And the answer was no. There was a tradition that was part of the oral tradition that Moses received from God at Mount Sinai. And so they knew how to conduct themselves with respect to these issues. But Ezekiel took that tradition and then gave a written verse, which then they could look to. Same with Isaiah. Like with respect to certain laws of Shabbos, we look to verses in Isaiah. But the Tanakh was complete by the time the sages are having these discussions. And that the priests were serving this in the second temple. However, if you're talking about the first temple, so then that's different. Now, it's a good question that you're asking, because in the first temple, definitely the Bible was still being written, right? Like the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, Zechariah, that's all post-first temple. The destruction of the first temple, that's in the Bible. So the Bible wasn't complete, but in terms of the passages that were being read by the high priest on Yom Kippur, either in the tabernacle or in the first temple or in the second temple, those passages came only from the Torah, so from the 5 books of Moses. Sharon, the term investment comes from this ritual of dressing in ritual or royal garments, vestments. Oh, good. So that's a nice feature of English, right? That the word investment comes from this idea that you would be dressed in royal vestments. And this was so poignantly described last Shabbos when Aaron put his vestments on Elazar. Right? So when it comes time for Aaron to leave this world, it's coming to an end. He's very old. Both him and Moses were very old. And now he's going to dress his son, Elazar, to succeed him as the high priest. So Sharon says, it was so poignant when Aaron put his vestments on Elazar. It was explained to me that it had to be done when Aaron was still alive so as not to render the garments impure. And that must have been so tragic and difficult for him, right? To step aside. The nice thing is, it's never quite that difficult when you're stepping aside and, giving it to your child to succeed you in it. Nevertheless, of course, it was difficult. It had to be difficult. I mean, we see how often people with great power and authority are loath to leave it behind. On the other hand, like Moses and Aaron, they were really, really pure-hearted people, right? The power of it, the authority of it, that's never what it was about for them, right? They took it so seriously, their obligations. And so, in part what was difficult for Aaron to step down is like he knew what to do and how to do it on behalf of the people. And there's got to be a little worry, is my son going to, he doesn't have the experience that I have. He hasn't been doing it. Is he going to be able to step into the role? And of course, he's confident that he will, but it's still not easy, right? So it's a very poignant moment, as you describe. And Tom, in the Shema Kolenu part of the Amidah, so hear our voice, right? We ask God to hear our voice, hear our prayers. In that part of the Amidah, the thrice repeated daily prayer, when it is traditional to add one's own requests, I always pray for sustenance and housing for me and for everyone else. A beautiful, beautiful prayer. Shkoyach Tom. And then I add also personal prayers there. I always pray, that help me, God, come closer to you, and help me help my family, my community, and everyone else come a little bit closer to you. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow for page 72, the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a beautiful evening.